Hey everyone, hope you're well. Welcome back to Poly 100. This week we are talking about public policy, which is a topic that I think is incredibly important in today's political environment, but something that often is sort of treated as an afterthought in a sort of intro to American politics classes. It comes towards the end of the semester as we're sort of winding down in our content delivery this semester. But again, I want to think about this topic as the pivotal sort of end product of the question of sort of who gets what, when, where, and how. Policy, as we'll see today, is really, I think, the so what, right? This is the actual who gets what delivery or distribution of resources that comes out of this sort of extremely complicated process that we've been studying all semester. That is, of the sort of selection of political elites that are then going to get into that arena of contestation of democracy and come together to make decisions that are going to ultimately impact these outcomes. And so if you recall last time, we were talking a lot about these free rider problems that came in when thinking about interest groups, right? The pressure groups that form this giant constellation, this heavenly chorus of different voices in American politics that, again, provide pressure on elected officials to make decisions that will affect that fundamental who gets what question. And so, again, if you recall from last time, I'm not going to belabor this point, but there were a number of different ways that these organizations could potentially solve collective action free rider problems and help sort of their groups coalesce around their particular causes. And so some of those include, giving people information or giving them little trinkets that make them be, happy and they can show them off to their friends. Solidarity benefits, providing essentially platforms for people to socialize and to hang out with each other and to learn things from one another. And then proposive benefits, making people feel like their, small contributions are in fact going to make a difference in the lives of other people or in whatever sort of policy outcome that they care about. And so these kinds of things allowed for these groups to be successful, despite the fact that baked into any collective action is this potential for a free rider problem. And the problem that remains in our discussion, and something that came out of our discussion at the end, was this kind of fundamental idea, which is that some of these interest groups are nevertheless, despite the existence of these various tools for overcoming collective action problems, some groups are simply easier to organize others. And so we talked about, for example, comparing this group called Bubble, the soft drink companies, not software companies, who are making sugary beverages. It's very simple for these groups to be able to put pressure on government, because essentially the CEOs of these large corporations can get together, or even just on their own, essentially invest in interest group activity, invest in staff organization pressure, and hire lobbyists to say, hey, we think that we should have subsidies on corn syrup, and we should make sure that soda can be in every marketplace in America. And as a result, you're going to see that public policy is going to start to favor those producers. And so the kind of pull quote from an early political scientist, E.E. Schattschneider, is this idea that the heavenly chorus of pluralism, this idea that we've got all kinds of different interests in our society that are trying to exert pressure in this arena of contestation of politics. In this arena, the heavenly chorus of pluralism seems to essentially favor elite, narrow, particularistic interests. And so again, the perfect example here is that the Poverty Action Assistance Network group has a much harder time overcoming their collective action problems than does like the very large corporation. And so this is, of course, something that at its most foundational logic shouldn't be that surprising to us. I'm sure many of us have heard narratives about this idea. And I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people view lobbying and the sort of interest group universe with a little bit of skepticism and a little bit of negativity in today's politics. But I think when we go, and back up a little bit and think again about the outcomes, the things that we care about here in terms of who gets what, we're really talking about public policy. And so essentially that is any kind of lawmaking or bureaucratic action we can think of as public policies. And so, obviously these are all sort of different things, right? Laws coming from Congress, rules, statutes, and edicts coming from bureaucracy, different bureaucracies making specific sort of provisions within the law to specify outcomes. This is what we together call public policy. And public policy, I think, is at its basis about providing incentives or disincentives for individuals to do certain things, right? Which then promote certain social outcomes. So it's all about, again, going all the way back to our early discussion in this class about sort of what is a political institution and how do sort of different rules and regulations of government influence people, right? What does a law ultimately do, right? It provides incentives and disincentives for people to act certain ways, which result in, at the mass level, when we aggregate this up to a whole society, right, different social outcomes. And so, of course, we can assume, we can sort of, be aware of the fact that, much like the fact that in the interest group sort of universe, we've got imbalances potentially that might emerge. Policy might not always mirror all the interests of everyone in America, right? And so some scholars have pointed to this idea of mobilization bias, which is exactly what we've been talking about in terms of interest groups. Essentially, if you have a narrow, particularistic interest, and that is to say, if we go back to that rational choice kind of logic, if we think that the benefits to a group for engaging in lobbying and pressure on government are incredibly sort of direct and clear, they're going to have a much easier time sort of rationalizing the costs of those activities. Whereas if you're maybe like a group of consumers or something, you're going to have a much harder time figuring out, or at least rationalizing to yourself, my $20 I'm donating to this organization is going to have some kind of material impact on my life. Right? It may feel a little bit more like you're just sending $20 off into the void, and who knows what happens then. So these broader groups that have what we call diffuse interests, we might expect, because of the fact that they have a much more challenging collective action problem to overcome, are going to naturally struggle in this arena to get together, essentially, and have their say. So I think a little thought experiment might help to kind of reinforce this idea of mobilization bias. And so I know many of us who live in the state of Maryland have Comcast or Xfinity as their internet service provider, and I hope that as I'm broadcasting this through the internet that Xfinity doesn't get mad at me. But I could imagine, right, asking you this question: would you be in favor of paying more money for your internet if you were to exceed 300 gigs per month of internet use? So if you were to stream a lot of TV shows, if you were to do a lot of gaming or something, or if you were to, hey, for example, attend classes online and do a lot of data transaction as you're watching videos and engaging in content modules and attending live stream classes, right? You might go over that threshold, and that would mean that Comcast would be able to say, hey, you went over this limit, we're going to charge you a little extra add-on fee for using more internet than everyone else. And so I can imagine, right, the answer to this first question, unless you're somebody who works for Comcast, right, your answer is going to probably be no. Like, I don't like that. I would rather not pay more. And I think that essentially a data cap like this on home internet seems a little bit onerous, right? It seems like a bad idea. And so the question is, like, I've got a car, right outside. I've got my mask, and I'm all socially distanced, and I'm ready to go to Washington and stand, outside of the relevant authorities and protest this business model and say data caps on home Wi-Fi are bad. I'm ready to go. Okay, Ellie's with me. She's got, I'll make her a little sign. She's ready to protest. No data caps. Are we going to do this? Who's coming with me? Right? And I know, obviously, this is a sort of an artificial exercise because this is not in real time. But you can imagine that even if a couple of enterprising students are like, yeah, let's go, we're doing this, it's not going to be the whole class, right? Not all 100 students or however many students, right? 20 students in a section, right? Not all students are going to want to come with me to do this. However, the sort of corollary question is Comcast willing to hire lobbyists to defend this business model, right? Do you think that Comcast has a vested interest in this and is able to then put pressure using their own resources? And the answer to that question is resoundingly yes. In fact, of course, we know that they're doing this all the time. They're putting pressure on members of Congress, on various FCC, various bureaucracies to try to say, hey, data caps like this are perfectly legal, and in fact, we think that this is necessary for our survival in our business model. And so the fact that we are all not in Washington right now are sending letters to our representatives about this issue, but we know for a fact that Comcast is actively doing this. That's mobilization bias in a nutshell, right? We're the consumers. We all, I have, and many of you have Xfinity. We're all consumers of Xfinity or Comcast. However, we're not putting pressure on government as consumers trying to have our say, because the benefits to that activity, that's extremely diffuse. However, the costs are real. Like writing a letter to Congress on this issue would take time and resources that we would otherwise preserve for other things like doing our writing assignments and preparing for our final exams. And so Comcast, though, they do 24 hours a day is think about their own business, and so they're a much more particularistic interest. So these kinds of interests tend to win out over diffuse interests like consumers. So essentially, this is another sort of issue that comes from this inequality or imbalance in the interest group society. And so when we take this all the way to its conclusion, what we can think about is what happens as a result of these kinds of pressures. What happens as a result of various individuals' sort of pressure on government. And these are public policies, right? Detailed rules created and enforced by government agencies, largely by bureaucratic regulation. And so, again, these are the nitty-gritty details of policy that, after broad-based laws are passed that outline kind of the direction of various government initiatives, bureaucracies come in and they fill in the details with all of this rich language, right, that ultimately forms regulation. And so the FCC, we've already talked about this bureaucracy in the unit on media. In terms of Comcast as an internet service provider would be beholden to FCC regulations. And so if the FCC were to feel that it was in the interest of the public, they might be able to enforce some kind of regulation, some sort of rule that would say, hey, data service provider companies, you can't do this. You can't throttle, you can't upcharge, you can't put caps on people's data consumption. That's not a fair business practice. And so at the end of the day, these decisions get made in Washington, and they get changed, and they're the result of all kinds of different pressures. We as scholars, right, if we want to study these kinds of things, right, trace the causes of these changes to their effects, right, figure out how the interest group society is functioning to create these kinds of regulations, or to uphold them, or to observe them getting essentially annulled. This is ultimately the study of public policy analysis. And so it's a field that's very, very sort of intimate with political science. Political scientists are not sort of strictly public policy analysts, but it's a very important field, and one that you may find yourself interested in the future if you'd like to pursue a career doing research. Public policy analysts are working tirelessly to try to better understand the effects and the ramifications of these various policies for the outcomes that affect Americans, that is, who gets what, when, why, and how. And so, again, public policy analysis is a very important field, and one that is, a lot of what they do essentially is looking at the effects of these regulations and thinking about anticipating as well what a new regulation might do in terms of who gets what, when, and how. So another example that we could think about when studying public policy, trying to analyze the situation here is, for example, and this is one that actually comes back to that interest group that we were talking about, bubble, right? Many cities and many public health agencies across the country and across the world, in fact, have been noticing that essentially an adverse public health outcome, from a macro level perspective, has been essentially obesity levels have been rising, and that's led to sort of more health problems in general, sort of in the public, putting a strain on hospitals and making things more difficult for for societies ultimately. And so, from a social perspective, I think some governments have said this is not a thing that we particularly like. This increases the cost of healthcare. This makes preventable deaths happen. This is not good. And so some cities, for example, in the United States, have tried to target this issue and say we're going to try to reduce obesity in the population by making sort of slight changes to the way that we handle the distribution of sugary beverages. And so this is one of the different kind of tools here, right? Could revolve around using sort of carrots, right, to incentivize certain behavior, or sticks, essentially, to try to punish certain kinds of behavior. And so I wonder, you should pause the slide here for just a second and think to yourself, what are some tools, right? What are some of these tools that a city government could use potentially to influence the consumption, essentially the per capita consumption of sugary beverages, that is, soda and, those like iced teas and stuff, things with like a very large amount of sugar in them. What kinds of tools, policy tools, could a city use to actually change these outcomes? And I want you to think about also whether or not you think that they would be effective. So pause the slide for a second, think about that question, and then let's come back and talk about it. So there's a few different possibilities we could consider here. One being this what's called a sin tax. Okay, and this is a common kind of public policy tool. Essentially, this idea that you can put an extra tax on top of things where there's a public health benefit to reducing consumption. So obviously cigarettes, that's a really big sort of sin tax area. A lot of municipalities, a lot of states, a lot of governments across the world have placed really high taxes on cigarettes because obviously cigarettes are linked to many very negative health outcomes. Alcohol consumption as well. We've seen even in Maryland, right? There's extra taxes on top of your regular sales tax, which go along with alcohol, and so that kind of thing. Obviously, the public sort of benefit is it would be damaging to overall public health to have a lot of people, sort of overindulging in alcoholic beverages. And by making these things slightly more expensive, people might think twice about buying too much, right? And then, experiencing those negative health outcomes that are associated with, alcoholism and other problems, right? And so these kinds of taxes, it's a simple supply and demand economics 101 kind of idea, right? The more expensive a product is, the smaller amount that people will buy. And so this could be one potential situation here. And actually, at least one city in America actually did try this at some point, right? Increasing the taxes on sugary beverages. Another thing that you could do as a city is you could create new regulations on advertising. So this is obviously something that, again, if we're putting sugary beverages, and this is maybe not a fair comparison, right, into the category of sort of these taxable things like cigarettes, for example. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have seen the packaging surrounding cigarettes in America today have a lot of warnings on them. In Australia, they're actually very graphic to try to prevent smoking. They've got pictures of sick lungs and things, and people's just very very negative health outcomes printed on the label. And of course, there's a lot of regulations in the United States now about advertising, cigarettes, on television, for example. Because again, the federal government has essentially identified that this is not something that should be marketed, and especially not marketed to young people. There's a third possibility that we could think about here, and that might be to create some kind of agency that would be responsible for public health education. And so essentially you could create, in that sense, certain kinds of advertisements that would say, hey, make healthy choices, don't drink that soda, drink something with lower calories in it or something. And maybe teach people, come to schools, do assemblies where they teach kids about making healthy choices, all kinds of ways that you might be able to change people's mentality without changing the cost and benefits of the actual price of the item. Right. And then another sort of policy approach that we can think about from the perspective of a city is to do nothing, right? And that's again another option essentially when it comes to public policy is maybe the municipality could argue this is not the purview of government. And I know some people who are sort of small government advocates might be looking at this whole situation as we've been talking about and saying why should government be responsible for telling me whether or not I can drink 17 Dr. Peppers every day? Shouldn't that be my personal choice? Why are you trying to stop me essentially from doing something that, I know the health risks, I know that this is not good for me, but I want to do it anyway. This is a free country. Shouldn't you be able to let me just absolutely get all my calories from soda? Not a super great move, but if you want to do it, go ahead, right? And so maybe sort of smaller government advocates might say, this is not up to government to decide. This is up to the individual consumer to make a choice. And so there's all kinds of different sort of flavors and, pun intended, right? Flavors of approaches to this soda situation that again really get us into the details of policy analysis. And for a lot of these things, when we're studying public policy, we could make, we could do sort of detailed studies of places where these things were rolled out. What were the effects, essentially, the causal effects of raising taxes on soda? What were the causal effects of new regulations or advertising regulations or of new health education policies? What kinds of effects might have taken place? Did it actually decrease soda consumption? Did it have no effect? Did it actually have some sort of backfire effect where it actually increased the rate of consumption of soda? Like these kinds of things actually reminded people that soda is delicious, and people started drinking more of it. That's certainly another part of public policy, is the possibility for sort of backfire effects or adverse consequences of your policy designs. And so again, this is a very important topic for all kind of governmental studies. And it's something, again, that we only have the briefest amount of time to sort of touch on in this particular class, but something that is, not just, it's not just a whole class that you could take on this. It's more than just a single semester we could spend on this. But in fact, UMBC actually goes so far as to not even just have a department of public policy, but a school of public policy. Right? There's an entire academic unit that's actually designed to address these kinds of questions, to analyze public policy and the outcomes of public policy, and to compare different policies and their ramifications. So another sort of issue that we can think about, and again, just to introduce you to some of the logic, some of the debates that modern scholars are having around public policy, is this other thing called a stealth benefit. And so stealth benefits are essentially sort of tricks in the public policy space. It's what happens when individuals in government create public policies with essentially labels that make them sound like they have very broad, diffuse benefits that are going to affect a whole lot of people, but those benefits actually turn out to be particularistic. So these policies are really designed with very small clientele in mind, but they're made to look like they're going to have a broad social benefit or social influence. And so, this is one sort of topic here, stealth benefits, that is especially used when talking about tax policy. And so we could go way into the weeds on tax policy. This is something that I'm a little bit of sort of a tax policy fan, right? I really enjoy this kind of this area of public policy. But one of the biggest questions in public policy today is sort of, what's the tax code going to look like, right? What does it mean when we devise sort of tax brackets for different people? What does this actually look like? And one piece of this that we've noticed over time is that tax reform since the 1980s, from a bipartisan perspective, right, both Republicans and Democrats have reformed taxes over time. From 1980 to 2017 was the most recent sort of major reform to the tax code. This was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of the Trump administration. A lot of tax policy from the 1980s forward were about trying to close loopholes for essentially allowing very wealthy people to claim certain kinds of deductions on their taxes and get away with paying lower taxes altogether. So, for example, in the 80s, a big example of this was many sort of CEOs and other sort of big executives were able to take these business lunches they would comp as sort of tax deductible expenses. And so it was very common to have like sort of whole boardrooms going out for these lavish 2-3 hour lunches in the middle of every workday, because they're able to comp all of those expenses on their tax forms. And so cutting out sort of the comped business lunch tax loophole was a big piece of certain reforms in the 1980s, in addition to other kinds of things. And so in the 2000s, sort of the focus on tax code reform moved from loopholes to the rates, essentially the rates in the brackets. And so in the 2000s, we saw Larry Bartels, a prominent political scientist, essentially studied these tax cuts and showed that what happened with these cuts was the top tax rates came down, there were reductions in taxes on dividends and capital gains, and a gradual elimination of estate taxes. And so this was definitely one of the ways that these tax cuts in the early and mid 2000s were advertised. And I guess one question that you might consider as we move through this discussion is, do you think that if you were to show this to the average American and say, this is what this tax cut is going to accomplish, if the average American would be in favor of or opposed to a tax cut of this nature? And certainly those of you who are thinking about the average American's kind of understanding of this will fall on the side of people who are generally really in favor of this, right? This sounds great, right? Cuts in these cuts in taxes, reductions in taxes on dividends, and elimination of estate taxes. That sounds like my taxes are going to be lower, right? It sounds really good. And so the answer to the question, do you think most people supported these tax cuts, is that people definitely supported these cuts. However, again, this is an example of a stealth benefit, because as it turns out, only an incredibly small percent of Americans were really meaningfully affected by these three changes to the tax code. These are actually changes to the tax code that only affect individuals with extraordinarily high incomes and extraordinarily high levels of wealth. And so definitely, middle-class Americans got a little bit of a tax break, right? But if you think about the way in which that tax code was imbalanced in terms of the focus on these particularistic benefits at the top, what ended up happening was, talk about budget deficits, right? Talk about an imbalance between the sort of amount of revenue that government needs to fund programs, social services, other stuff, and the amount of money that government is asking people to pay in. Right? There's a gap here that emerges almost instantaneously. And so if you were a sort of a savvy policy analyst, you'd look at this and say, there's some adverse consequences potentially to a tax cut that's going to provide this steep of a cut at the top and very marginal cuts down in the middle and at the bottom. And so nevertheless, right, these cuts were extremely popular. The vast majority of middle-class Americans thought this was a great deal, even though, again, when it materially wasn't really sort of designed to give them the cut they thought they were getting. And so stealth benefits, again, these are particular effects of policies which aid specific groups but seem like they will affect most people. And so another example that I might give you is homeowner tax credits. And so I know many of you in the class are thinking about hopefully one day, owning a home. And I encourage you to go through that. I know that it's an incredibly difficult process right now. And, for those of you who currently are homeowners, right, I think you're well aware that property values are doing some very strange things in this particular economy, especially in a dense area like in Maryland, making it very difficult, certainly to purchase a home. When we think about these homeowner tax credits, what this essentially says is that you might be able to, for example, deduct the amount of interest that you pay on a mortgage. So there's a federal home mortgage interest deduction that you're able to take if you itemize your taxes. And so this essentially this credit has been designed to incentivize homeownership, to mean that if you've got a big mortgage where you're paying a lot in your payments, whatever you're paying in interest, you're ending up being able to deduct that from your taxes if you file your taxes in a very specific way. And so it might sound like, hey, this is a policy that's designed for everyone. But if you actually look at the data on who it is that actually claims this credit, it's basically people who have bought extremely expensive houses. Right? These are people who have bought, $1 million houses that are taking this home mortgage interest deduction and itemizing their taxes for that specific sort of purpose. And so even most homeowners aren't materially affected as much by this credit as are very wealthy homeowners with very big houses. And so when it comes down to it, you might think the home mortgage interest deduction sounds like a policy designed for the middle class average American, when in fact it is actually a much smaller sort of clientele base that's getting the material benefit from it. And so, we can think about policy alternatives, right? If we were to take the amount of money that essentially the government is failing to collect by giving away this credit, what could we use, that money for, or that, what space could we carve out in the tax code if we were to not have that credit? And the alternative could include, for example, a renter's credit, which would say if you're spending a lot of your income on rent, then maybe the federal government will, prevent that money from being seen when you're being taxed at the end of the year when you do your taxes. And so, for example, in the state of Indiana, you have renters credits, which, as a starving graduate student in, the mid 2010s, was a big boon for me, right? I was able to take that credit on my state taxes, but not on my federal taxes, even though, a lot of my income, my very meager income as a graduate student, was going towards rent. And so again, these policy choices have serious material consequences, and they have material consequences for varieties of different stakeholders around, the tax brackets in the system. So again, stealth benefits can be very important, and this again really speaks to the idea that we need to be super vigilant, and we need to do our homework and understand what the real material implications of these policies are for average Americans, if we're going to be able to evaluate as adults, as citizens, as people who are invested in this political process by virtue of living in our country, right? We've got to be, knowledgeable about this stuff and inform ourselves about what kinds of, real material, who gets what kind of outcomes come out of all these policies. So this is the challenge, I think, of citizenship, and something that we need to take seriously if we're to be, effective in our political advocacy. And so again, just to show you, I mean, really, this is a graph where basically the lines go down, right? This is just showing that the average tax rates for the highest income taxpayers are basically going down and down over time, and now sit at historically incredibly low rates. And again, just really showing this idea that through specific kinds of tax code changes that we've seen, especially beginning in the 1980s, right? Look at 1980 to the 2000s. This is a very steep drop here. Taxes among the very wealthy, right, the top 0.01% of Americans, from a historical perspective, going back even now almost 100 years, are historically and unprecedentedly low. So again, something to think about as Americans. Ask yourself, right, is this something that what are the effects, right? What are the effects on who gets what? And this is a very grainy image, of course, of the kind of critiques that emerged in the early 2000s about these kinds of tax cuts, where here's Homer Simpson. You may even not be able to see this, but Homer Simpson's got $2 in his hand, and he's saying, woohoo, high five, because he got his tax cut, right? And then here's Mr. Burns, obviously representing Springfield's wealthy scion, saying, sucker, right? Ha, look, he's got all these bags of money in the form of tax rebates. And so again, really sort of encapsulating the logic of a particularistic benefit that's made to look like it's a broad-based benefit. There's all kinds of, as I've said, right, there's all kinds of other examples here, the federal mortgage interest tax deduction, all kinds of other examples we could think about, both in the tax code and outside of the tax code, which form these kinds of particularistic stealth benefits relative to broad-based consumer benefits. The next thing that we want to engage in, I think, in our discussion of public policy is, I think, a fundamental question, which is, what constitutes a legitimate reason for government to intervene through some kind of regulation? And again, going back to the soda example, this kind of syntax soda example, this is a really, I think, straightforward one, right? Does government have a role here, right? Does government have a role in trying to limit people's consumption of soda? Some people would fall on the side, and I know many of you are probably right now, as you're watching this, thinking about this, and I can guarantee you, for every one of you who's thinking, yeah, it seems like that would be good, right? We want to make sure that our population is healthy, and if we can make small changes to our policies and regulations to encourage healthy behavior so that people will live longer and that they won't, put a strain on the hospital system or whatever, right? That could be a good thing, right? There's probably, for every student that's thinking that, I can guarantee you there's probably another student who's thinking to themselves, what's next, right? Are you kidding me? Right? Just tax soda, out the wazoo. Like this is government overreach, and this is too much of a burden, right, on the individual. There's going to be a variety of opinions when it comes to pretty much every sort of regulatory regime. Some people thinking that we need less government, some people thinking that we need more government. The people who are sort of critics of big government, to sort of give them their say, right, would complain that a lot of these regulations can stifle essentially creativity and entrepreneurship. Certainly a key term to emerge from this discussion is red tape. This idea that it's very difficult, you have to go through an extremely complicated process I know Ellie apparently is a small government cat. She doesn't like red tape either. Essentially this idea that, like, say you want to start a business somewhere, say you want to open up a fast food franchise or something in, Baltimore City, you're going to face a lot of different regulations where you're going to have to essentially go through a ton of hoops, probably hire some lawyers, appear before several, political agencies in Baltimore City and show them that you're, going to do things by the book and make sure that, the building that you're in has been properly remediated for lead and all kinds of stuff. It's going to take a lot of effort on your part just to get started. And that's because you have a lot of bureaucracy to get through in order to, to actually have your business get off the ground. Nevertheless, right, proponents of that regulation might say, well, that stuff's there for a reason, right? We don't want you to, this isn't the Wild West. We don't want you to run rampant and break a bunch of rules that could lead to people, becoming endangered. And so that's, again, a perennial sort of debate, conflict in government is sort of the threat of red tape versus the threat of sort of bad operators breaking through this stuff and engaging in behaviors and practices that are going to be unfair or that are going to be illegal. So again, I think a really fundamental question with public policy. We can take that discussion, right? That fundamental question of sort of more or less regulation and sort of governmental involvement, and we can blow that up to the macro level as well. And I certainly want to just point you to this idea. I don't want to go too far into it because this is maybe the topic of discussion that would be more at home in a comparative politics class that we offer at UMBC. But certainly there's a variety of different approaches to this that different countries have taken, and we can give kind of vaguely, broad-based labels to these kinds of regulatory regimes in different countries. So, in the United States, for example, we've got sort of laissez-faire regulated capitalism, which means that we essentially are relative to other countries, we have a lot less sort of market intervention. We're a pretty sort of laissez-faire kind of focused market economy, despite the fact that in any case, right, in a modern market economy, there's going to be at least some governmental regulation and involvement. And so an example of this might be the regulation of the labor market, right? And by the labor market, I mean essentially people getting jobs, people working jobs in America today for companies. A fundamental question is, do we think that the government should intercede in the labor market and try to prevent labor market failures like unemployment? And so a labor market failure might occur, right, if people were to seek jobs and be unable to find them. And so if you're a job seeker and you're looking for a job, and you're like, I've got these skills, I know how to do X, Y, Z, and yet there's no demand for those skills, or the demand for the skills has already been saturated by other people who are currently holding those jobs, then you're in trouble, right? You're genuinely in trouble. And, we can go back only a couple of decades in, for example, here in Baltimore, to changes in the structure of the labor market really influencing negatively a lot of people who had moved to Baltimore only a couple of decades earlier for work, right? For many of you, it's probably not an unheard of story, right? That Baltimore's heyday was in the 1950s. The city's population was well over 1 million people, and by that I mean inside of the political geography of Baltimore City, not the county. Within the city itself, you had over 1 million people living there. Row house after row house after row house was being built. You had these giant sort of communities of people, many immigrants, many people who had come from the deep south to seek work, and from the sort of western areas, mountain areas, to seek work. And they were going to work in big factories. They were going to do all kinds of manual labor. There's a big factory focus in this time in the city, right? We were doing industry, we were doing steel. Sparrows Point, all these places, shipping, obviously the port of Baltimore is still here. And so we were, a blue collar industrial town with 1 million strong, workforce of people who were working good jobs and bringing home good pay. And Baltimore was a place where prosperity, right, was yours if you could get here, right? However, obviously with the offshoring of a lot of these jobs and the decline of manufacturing across the United States, this resulted in a huge imbalance where then all of a sudden you had this population that was seeking new work and no new work was available. And so the question was, what was government to do? Would they just essentially let this happen naturally and cause people to experience the indignity of unemployment, long-term unemployment that might lead to them losing their places of residence and essentially the shirt off their backs, right? I mean, like this could be something that the unemployment experience could be something that, if not mitigated, could cause people to essentially spiral into really, really bad outcomes, right? Once you fall into like a homelessness trap or some kind of poverty trap, it's extremely hard to work your way back out of it, even if you still possess those skills, even if you still possess all kinds of innate advantages. It's not going to work, right? Because all of a sudden there's a lot of stigma that arises as well. And so from that time forward, and from obviously the Great Depression, the Great Recession as well, where we had a lot of turnover in the tech industries. And I mean, I don't need to belabor this point, right? This is a perennial story in America. Not only is the question, should government intercede to try to essentially stave off the negative effects of unemployment, how should we do it? And that, I think, is the more important question, and one that's been the subject of much political debate over time. And so, again, I hesitate to use this kind of term because it carries with it a lot of loaded connotations in American politics specifically. Across the world, people use this terminology to refer to what I'm talking about here very neutrally, without some sort of negative connotation. But essentially, when we talk about unemployment provisions and all sorts of other sort of government-sponsored guarantees to lessen the consequences, the negative impacts of falling into this poverty trap, we call this the welfare state, essentially. And so it's a set of policies designed to alleviate poverty and social ills, to help people essentially re-enter the labor market and to obtain the tools that they need to be successful again, retraining, developing new skills, new and better skills to be able to seek the jobs that are available in their country. And so some countries have what we might call cradles to the grave universalistic welfare states. And by that I mean essentially that, you've got free publicly funded kindergarten, for example, in countries like Sweden and Denmark, that you begin your life with these kinds of, universal public services, and all the way through your entire life, free public health care, and then of course pensions and sort of a more expansive kind of social security in your old age as well. You're being cared for, and of course if you were to experience some kind of unemployment or loss of work, you're also going to be sort of cared for with strong and sort of very targeted unemployment assistance. And so these kind of countries, they have very high taxes on average, but those taxes are then paid, they pay into a system that has a much stronger, what we might call safety net. Another kind of style of this is what we might call corporatist or pay in, pay out welfare regimes, in which there's kind of a floor here of services that you can access if you're having trouble. And yet, if you pay into the system a lot, if you're somebody who's worked for 30, 35, 40 years at a single company, for example, that sort of entitles you to additional benefits, especially in retirement and old age. And so, again, this is a slightly more stratified example, but a little bit, also essentially this pay in, pay out system still provides a pretty solid floor for universalistic kind of welfare access, which means that it's not, you don't need to prove your case as much to be able to obtain these benefits. In the US, the UK, and Canada, and other countries, we have what we call liberal or means-tested welfare regimes, which means that you really have to do a lot of legwork to prove that you're in need of these services in order to receive them, and they tend to be very targeted. So a much smaller proportion of Americans sort of tap into these resources on a yearly basis, whereas again in countries like Sweden and Denmark, many people are sort of having an experience or accessing or sort of taking advantage of various social programs all the time. And so again, with means-tested welfare programs, you end up having a lot more stigma that comes into that system, because only people that are desperately in need of it tend to use it. Whereas here, everybody sends their kids to public kindergarten, for example. It's not really as much of a stigmatized sort of system. So again, we have very different flavors here that come from different sort of political cultures and different long-term kind of policy options that have been selected. Another question about market economies we could think about is whether government should promote or restrict competition in industries. And so, if we think about, for example, telephone providers, we think about also going back to Comcast or Xfinity, right? Cable and internet providers, right? Should government intervene in the case when a single company owns all of the market share? Should they act to break up those monopolies, or should they sustain those monopolies and in fact encourage those monopolies in certain cases by providing sort of exclusive government contracts? Should the government intervene to stimulate or cool the rate of economic growth? That's a really important question, right? How could, in the US, we have a thing called the US Federal Reserve System that has a bunch of different sort of tools, right? Fiscal tools and tools in which they set interest rates and stuff. How do we do that, right? And again, right, this has been a perennial political question, and the answers to these questions have changed over time. We think about, for example, the strong sort of fiscal New Deal spending model versus Reaganomics, which is a much different kind of approach. And even now, in sort of the COVID period, right? One question that we might have is, is it sufficient to provide sort of direct cash transfers to people who are suffering from the negative effects of the COVID economy, giving people $1,200 like a flat fee unless they make too much money to receive it, right? Is that the right policy, or should there be some other kind of policy, right? Should we give money to states to be able to support certain programs? Should we administer that stuff directly to individuals? Should we give people tax breaks? How do we do it, right? That's the stuff of public policy. And I think at the end of the day, right, all of these discussions really center on this question of who gets what, the fundamental question we've been discussing throughout the semester. But in these discussions, I think that you start to really appreciate the fact that the devil is in fact in the details. that despite the fact that we've got these broad-based kind of policy regimes, the different flavors essentially of policy that the American government has carried forward through decades, at the end of the day, right, the question of whether or not we're going to end up paying more for Comcast internet because they're going to throttle us or put caps on our data, that comes down to a very specific decision being made at the FCC on a given day. And so from the macro level, from this huge kind of policy regime perspective, all the way down to the nitty-gritty effects of very specific day-to-day policies. Again, my exhortation to you is to remain vigilant and to really think carefully. This is why we as Poly 100 students need to be vigilant and use the tools that we have at our disposal, having learned so much in this class, to again be more active and more responsible citizens going forward, because your data caps are at stake, right? The material consequences are real for you, and they're not that diffuse. They actually have major impacts. So be thinking about these, think about examples, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss those soon with you in class. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.